Okay, we seem to have leveled off. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have a wonderful talk ahead of us. Dr. Maria Choi Pena is an assistant professor in educational foundations at Montclair State. She is, as a neurodiverse, bilingual, biliterate researcher, she examines the intersections of disability, language, school, parent, partnerships, and education policy. Maria focuses specifically on Latinx bilingual children with disabilities, their families, and their ability to access multilingual inclusion within public schools. Feel free to turn your camera on so she can see who she's talking to. We will ask you to kind of keep your mute on. There will be a discussion after class, so if you think of questions, by all means, write them down and she will address them at the end. I'll be fading off into the background to let you all enjoy your class. Thank you for coming. Maria, take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Patty, and thank you so much to the Montclair Public Library for sponsoring and hosting this talk. And I'd also like to thank Montclair State University for making this opportunity possible. I'm so excited to see so many familiar faces. Hi, friends. Today is a really exciting day for me, and I'm so glad that I get to share it with all of you. So here's a really fun fact. When I was 3 years old, I was princess of the reading parade in Dominican Republic. Big deal. My husband didn't think it was true for a really long time until I showed up with receipts and pictures. And while today I don't have a picture of that to share with you guys, this moment is really special for me because coming from that place of being the princess of the reading parade to getting to be here to talk about my own work with all of you is super exciting. So in honor of, wait 1 second. I'm wearing real clothes for you guys, shoes too, full on makeup. And this dress is really important and special for me because this was my mom's dress. And I was planning to wear it to my graduation from graduate school after I got my PhD, but I moved to New Jersey and added a couple pounds and then it didn't work. I mean, like there were no Spanx that were gonna make that possible. But today I'm wearing it. And so I thought that this would be a really great moment and a really great way of honoring her. She's a super important person in my life, and I would not be here. This book project would not be here without her sacrifices and the sacrifices that so many mothers make. And I'm also really grateful, and I recognize that I'm here because of all the teachers I've had the privilege of knowing in my life, both as a student, as a colleague, and as their educator. So I'm really, really grateful for that. And I'm really thankful to be here to celebrate Latinx Heritage Month in this way. Often this month is filled with festivals, food, and folklore. And I think it's really important that we center realities and struggles and successes as well when we talk about Latinx people during this month. So I'm really glad to be able to share this with you in the hopes that you can pick up this information and take it forward and help other Latinos and Latina mothers do right by their kids, because that's really what they want to do. So with that in mind, I have a little flow planned. So first, I'm going to share a little bit of context about who I am, how I see the world, and how this book kind of came to be, which is what I'm calling the planting of seeds. And then I'll shift into talking about the book and read some sections of it and share that with you. Hopefully my publisher won't mind all the screenshots that I'm sharing today. It's our secret. And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So please feel free to put questions in the chat while I'm talking, and I can look at them later, but I just know that I won't address them until the end. Sound good? Awesome. Are you guys feeling good? I'm so psyched. Okay. So this work in this book is really rooted in my personal and professional experiences. both as a child and a student and as a mother and a teacher. So I am the daughter of a Spanish-speaking monolingual Latina woman who I am an immigrant myself. I arrived in the US in 1990. I was an emergent bilingual, right, which meant that I was also learning English in school. I was a bilingual education student. I was a classified child, right? So I received therapies and services as part of my educational background. And I was also a bilingual special education teacher, and now I'm a bilingual special education researcher and teacher educator. But the other thing that really influences my work is my role as a mother, because it really allows me to understand the experiences of my mother and the women whose work I share from a different perspective. And so I hope that some of that is also brought forward in the writings of this book. Whoopsie daisy. So how I see and approach the world. So first, I believe in intersectionality. I believe that we are all the products of our different identities and positionalities in the world. For me, right, my identity as a woman can't be separated from my identity as an immigrant, which can't be separated from my identity as a Black woman, which can't be separated from my identity as a neurodiverse woman, right? So all of those things inform each other and come together to form who I am. And when I move about the world, my experiences reflect all of those positionalities. And in certain moments, it could be some more than others, but it's never something that I can shed from myself, right? And be like, I'm not a Black woman today, right? Like that's just not something that's possible for me. The second way that I understand education, the second lens that I have in the world is thinking of language rights as human rights. I don't believe in language as a commodity. I don't believe in language as a resource for financial gain, but rather language as a human right, as a right that people have to be able to navigate the world in the languages that they possess, to be able to have their needs met in the languages that they possess. Without discrimination or alienation. I also believe in disability as a social construction, right? Which means that what we believe to be disability or brokenness in people or abnormalities are really just human varieties, right? Variation in human diversity. But what makes it an impediment or what makes it a handicap is the ways in which we interact with the world, right? So that the world isn't really interested in diverse forms of moving, being, or thinking in the world. And so anyone who falls outside of the norm is considered to be at fault, right? And I recognize that as this tension between a social construct and an actual limitation in human beings. Finally, I bring to this work my belief in testimonios as tools of empowerment. Testimonios is a theoretical framework and idea that views storytelling as a political act, right? So we tell stories to change society. We tell singular stories to represent the issues of our communities, so that a single story isn't just an outlier, but representative of so many other stories in different fragments and facets. And that's really important for me to bring to this work because Testimonios is really based in Latin American political history. And so it's important to have a lens that originates in our community, right, with which to understand and unpack our stories. Okay, doing good, right? I'm breathing. I look good. Makeup isn't fully sweating off, so this is clutch. So I made a really conscious choice to structure the book into 3 different sections. I was really interested in making sure that the voices and stories of the women were centered and central. And so that's why their stories are in the second part of the book, right? That is really foregrounding them. And I tried to make sure to restrict my talking or my writing or analysis of their experiences to the first and last parts. And yet in that work, I made sure that the first part was really about situating the story in time, and that the ending of the book really needed to be about movement forward, right? About thinking about what do we do next and how do we take this on? But before I did all of this, I really made sure to center and share how I was coming to this work. And so I want to read the first excerpt for you, which actually comes from the preface. In an interest to be inclusive, I have the excerpt up on the screen if you're interested in following along. I'm going to be looking to the side because this is where actually I'm going to be looking up here because this is where my text is. So my story is an important place to start for multiple reasons. My life experiences are what led me to the fields of bilingual education and special education. As an educator, I've had the privilege of experiencing schooling from the stance of both a student and a teacher, from the lens of a daughter and a mother. More importantly still, I start with my story in recognition that we are in a moment in history when who you are and who the world makes you out to be need to be reconciled. It is important to share who I am in order for you as a reader to understand the women to whom this book is dedicated, the women whose stories fill the pages you are holding. It is important to understand that I arrived to this research from a place of longing, of emptiness, even if that was not evident to me when I started my doctoral journey, or even when I first wrote the dissertation that would eventually result in this book. Of wanting to see my mother's efforts, my sister's efforts as a young mother, my efforts as a racialized mother, every immigrant mother's efforts, every Black, Indigenous mother of color in the United States efforts to be represented from a place of strength and appreciation. I do this in stark contrast to what my educational background conditioned me to believe, that mothers like mine, Black and brown immigrants who didn't learn English fast enough, who were poor and working class, were empty vessels in need of filling. Over the years, mothers who are racialized as Black, Indigenous people of color have been framed as welfare queens and more recently as public charges. This book aims to chip away at those labels, to show the ways in which labels are mounted upon mothers as a way to devalue their contributions, as a way to rationalize the violence that is enacted upon them. I start this book by telling you about who I am because it is essential to understanding why I chose to study, not what happens to children in schools, but rather how what happens in schools reverberates through the home. Much of the academic scholarship that is written about mothers, Latinx mothers in particular, focuses on the ways in which schools can better support them and/or how schools can ensure that they are adequately equipped to support their children. All of this is written from a Western lens, a lens that evaluates Latinx mothers' contributions in relation to those of white mothers, which explains why another common lineage of education scholarship and research is grounded in explaining the cultural dynamics of Latinx families. Still, very little of this work is aimed at finding ways to make space for mothers' funds of knowledge, to make space for them, to ensure that their voices are heard. Most of it is aimed at explaining away their forced absence or to maximize the hidden labor that a school can extract from them. That is the literature that I consumed as a graduate student when working on my master's in science of education, when I was a classroom teacher, and when I started my doctoral journey. I swam and waded through those waters long enough to realize that the voices that were missing from those readings were those of the mothers themselves. So one of the things that ends up happening in academic scholarship is that people will argue that the way to make the work valid is to remove yourself as a researcher from that work. And for me, it was just something that I couldn't do, right? It was it is because of my life experiences, because of who I am, that I've even come to this work. And so it was really important for me to center that story, and to just get it out of the way at the very beginning, to be able to share with the readers who I was, right? So that they would be able to understand the choices that were being made and how these women were framed and how these women were being talked about. But before I can really talk to you about the study itself, or what ended up being, I want to take a moment to just share how it was that this work came to be. So I actually did a pilot study 3 years before the study that would be featured in this book. And in that study, I was really interested in talking to teachers about what their experiences had been in shifting from self-contained special education programs to integrated co-teaching settings. And from this study, I ended up interviewing a former colleague of mine, and she made this comment, right, which just really sparked a light bulb in my mind. She was talking about the complexities of the shift and how difficult and straining it was, and how there was a lot of confusion. But what was really great was that at one point she said, who I really feel bad for are the mothers. And I asked her to explain more. And she said, we don't have anything in Spanish. None of the homework is in Spanish. We don't know how to help our kids. Like, this is what the mothers are asking for, because when their kids were moved from these self-contained classrooms, they were also moved from bilingual spaces to monolingual English inclusive settings, right? So the social gain for these children came at a cost of language. And while this seemed to benefit the kids, right, on paper, when we look at the manifestations of this action on the family, we really start to notice how impactful these decisions became, right? Because now we were creating and widening the gaps between the home and the school. And that resulted in my research questions. The first was, what are the mothering experiences of Spanish-speaking Latinx mothers of emergent bilingual children labeled as disabled? I really wanted to know just what's it like, right? What is it like to raise your children, and to see what of school would come through that work. That first question wasn't really aimed at just thinking about these mothers as extensions of the school, right? But rather as centering them as mothers, as whole beings. And then the second question was around what values, perspectives, and ideologies do mothers hold about bilingualism and disabilities, and how those reflected in their lives at home and at school. Right. So this was the part where I really started to get to what's the relationship between these two spaces, and what's the relationship between these ideologies. And I started viewing mothers as kind of this intermediary and this bridge between the two communities. In time, I had to decide on a setting, and I decided to return to my community in Sunset Park. And because it was familiar to me, I had been a student there, but I had also been a teacher there, which is really rare in New York City, to both grow up in the same neighborhood, to work in the same neighborhood where you grew up, but also that I lived in that neighborhood, right? So I was really a member of that community. It was the only community that I really knew in this way. And it was from my experiences in this community that so many of my inquiries stemmed from. So it only felt appropriate to return to that space. I also knew that I could commit to contributing to that community for the rest of my life, right? So I wasn't going to be engaging in any kind of the research version of volunteerism, right? Where I just go in, excavate for what I need, and then leave, never to look back again. So that was the community. The timing was not ideal. I actually started recruiting around the end of October. And interestingly enough, it wasn't until the day after the election had been confirmed that I was able to recruit the bulk of my participants. And I talk about this in the book as just really highlighting how communities recognize the urgency that comes in a moment, right, in a political moment, and they also recognize the power of storytelling, because I had tried to recruit participants for weeks before this, and it wasn't until this moment of great anxiety and recognition that things are going to be shifting that we start hearing that I start seeing women being interested in signing up for this work and really wanting to talk to me about their experiences. Okay, so eventually 10 women were selected for participation in the study. The 10 women who took part in the study represented a range of experiences. They varied in age, marital status, number of children, education level, and time lived in the United States. All but one of the participants identified as a Mexican national, and most, 8 of the 10 were married. Still, they were bound together by the shared experiences of mothering emergent bilingual children who had been identified as having a disability, by their use of Spanish as a home language, and by their status as immigrants in the United States. Through the study, I would later find out that all of them had had some kind of relationship or contact with immigration, right? Immigration enforcement agents, because they either themselves were undocumented or had family members and immediate family members who were, although that was not a criteria for inclusion in the study. So in the first part of the book, I talk about why these mothers, and I start also talking about the methods that I've used, but I don't frame them exactly as methodology. So in other people's stories, I talk about the use of descriptive inquiry, right, and what it meant to me and how it shaped the ways that I approach this work. In setting the stage, I talk about the location and the setting of the work and the time period. And then at home with the testimonialistas, it's where I introduce the mothers really at a focal point. So before they start speaking, I give them space, and I provide myself space to kind of recognize my relationship to them as an observer and as an interlocutor of their stories. So this is the excerpt I have for this section. Oops, you can see. Okay. Sorry. Okay. From bilingual daughter to bilingual teacher. Throughout my childhood, my mother preached about the importance of an education and the value of being bilingual. While it was my role to help her navigate the English-only world, I also knew the lengths she went to in order to ensure that her needs did not interfere with my success in school. Still, I was witness to her never-ending balancing act as breadwinner and nurturer, and as such, I was privy to some of the sacrifices and many of the battles she endured. Yet, when I became a teacher, the experiences of mothers like mine seemed absent from the discourse. Spanish-speaking immigrant mothers like mine were often discussed by teachers and administrators in terms of their needs or their faults, rather than their actual lived experiences. Assumptions were made about their intentions and their capacity to engage with their children's academic lives. Oftentimes, these mothers were described in terms of their brokenness. I found this issue to be particularly true when the mothers who were being discussed were those who were raising children who were also labeled as disabled, a categorization that often contributed to children being viewed as broken as well. As a novice teacher, I also struggled to understand how teachers and administrators could view decisions around language of instruction as purely academic, when I knew from experience that there would be a significant impact on the home. However, I would soon realize that in the lives of children with disabilities, the home language is often viewed as a hindrance rather than a support. And so this was really important for me to showcase why these women, because I think when we talk about emergent bilinguals or we talk about students with disabilities, we tend to talk about them separately, right? And when we talk about children who are at the nexus of both of these experiences or both of these categorizations, we tend to foreground their disability needs, right, above their language needs. And part of that is because we've decided that it's more important for them to be normal, right, than to be connected to their family, right? And it's not that it has to be an either or, right? You could both be within the spectrum of normalcy and still have different ways of connecting and building relationships with communities. But it's not possible for us to do this if we disconnect children from their languages. And so I write about some of this. Ooh, too many screens. Oh, okay. So what is the impetus or the desire to center these mothers? So it was these experiences, both in the literature and with the literature and with my profession, that piqued my interest in studying mothers, particularly the mothers of emergent bilingual children who are also identified by the school as having a disability. I was interested in knowing the stories behind the faces that I had encountered over the course of my career as a bilingual special education teacher. I wanted to know about the hopes and dreams that these mothers carried with them as they dropped their children off at school. I was curious to know the values, perspectives, and ideologies mothers held about bilingualism and disabilities, and how, if at all, were those reflected in their lives at home and at school. Thus, in 2016, I sought them out, Spanish-speaking Latinx mothers raising children who had been identified as English language learners and as students with disabilities. After some time, I narrowed my scope to the mothers from Sunset Park, the community where I had been raised and where I had worked as a teacher. In time, I found 40 mothers, mothers I had never met before, but who, for some reason, chose to talk to me. In the end, I focused on the experiences of 10 mothers, and it is those 10 mothers and their experiences that carried this book. And I thought it was really important, though, for me to not only share how these women were decided, right, or how their stories were being shared, but what was my goal coming from this work. And so I'll just read briefly what I had, a section from where I list my intentions. This book aims not only to include the experiences of immigrant monolingual Spanish-speaking Latinx women, but also to shift the narrative from one that views them through deficit lenses: broken English, broken children, broken households, parts of broken systems, to one that acknowledges the ways in which they support their children's academic growth through means that are not in keeping with traditional values, but are no less meaningful. While these mothers and their children are constructed as broken because of their linguistic practices, socioeconomic position, disability labels, and immigration status, the stories featured in this book will highlight the ways in which mothers tirelessly work towards making their children feel and be seen as whole. And so that was really important for me. I really viewed this book and this project as a way of putting forth a whole image of these women, right? Not just one that was focused on suffering and struggle, right? But not just one that talks about the joys of motherhood, right? I wanted to be able to show these women in their complexity, because I think that when we look at them in their complexity, we're able to really see the force that they truly are, right? And what it is that they're doing and how they're navigating a world that is not meant for them, right? With all that they have in order to ensure that they can at least leave a world that's meant for their children, right? And I think that that's something really, really important to recognize, right? That these women allow themselves in some ways to be fragmented because they're so interested in having their children seen as whole. And so the second part of the book is really focused on centering the moms and the moms sharing their stories. And their stories are complicated. They talk about how I see disability labels, right? Which is also complex, right? They talk about disability labels as both a cross that they have to bear, but also a source of information and, you know, a light, right, for them, because they were in places where they had darkness and they had confusion and they didn't know how to support their child. They talk about their roles and the ways in which they try to counter their children's school-based monolingualism by becoming their children's language teachers at home. And they also talk about the tensions that are presented in their relationships by schools. But I want to just read an excerpt for you, because one of the things that I think was complicated for me about how I was seeing these women talked about is that they were being talked about in the literature as mothers and nothing else, right? Or as mothers to one child and nothing else. And Patty, who was one of the 3 mothers who became a testimonialista, and that means that I followed her and her family for several weeks. We did observations and many more interviews. She really, really was able to kind of highlight for me the complexity of what it means to be in the US as an undocumented woman, and what it means to be the mother of a child with a disability. So give me just 1 second and I'm gonna find my section. Okay. You guys can see the little lady that's cleaning with all the arms. Okay, great. And please bear with me, this part's going to be a little long, and I'm actually going to read the sections just in Spanish, but if you'd like to follow along in the English, please do, right? I feel like this is the one opportunity I have to really center Patty and give her space, and it feels important to me to do that in the way that she first communicated and made contact with me. Throughout the interview process, the mothers would often hint at the ways in which they were constantly being pulled in multiple directions. In response, I set up a series of interviews that would allow us to dive deeply and explicitly discuss the complexities of motherhood. During this interview, the 3 focal mothers were asked to list their responsibilities and any other concerns or pressing issues that they found taxing. In every case, the child with the disability was often last or missing from the list. The reason for this is that the mothers were managing much larger issues than their child's disability. They needed to support the needs of their other children, some of whom lived in other countries, had chronic health problems, were abusing drugs and alcohol, or were recovering from sexual assault. Additionally, the mothers were also caring for their aging and ailing parents, as well as serving as surrogate mothers for their own siblings. Unfortunately, the mothers were unable to turn to their partners for support because all of them were involved in abusive spousal relationships. While the impact that these factors have on mothers has been studied, they have not been positioned in relation to disability. In other words, existing studies tend to focus on one of the aforementioned issues, or on disability as maternal stressors, rather than a combination of all. This chapter highlights how all of these pressures, combined with social isolation, resulted in the mothers feeling overwhelmed and incredibly lonely. And so in this first part, I'm just going to showcase, this really complex story in which Patty shares for us why she came here, and kind of what ends up throwing her plan off the rails. Fractured roles, a mother to more than one. When asked where Dan's disability falls in her list of concerns, Patty indicates that ahorita no es tan importante porque él está estable. Right now, it's not that important because he's stable. She's much more concerned about her other child, Carlos Santos, who lives in Mexico and está consumiendo drogas, is consuming drugs. Pues ahorita sí, es una preocupación de que él no se empeore y a la misma vez, como que ahorita no es tan importante porque él está estable. Sí me preocupa sus estudios, como de Tania también, no sé. Pero ahorita lo que a veces está en mi cabeza, ahorita para mí, es mi hijo Carlos Antonio. Es eso lo que a veces me está preocupando ahorita más. Que Dan y Tania me tienen aquí, claro, no las 24 horas porque yo también trabajo, pero ellos también van a la escuela. Pero todo el tiempo posible yo puedo estar con ellos. Y sin embargo, con mi hijo, no. Con los dos, porque solamente son por teléfono. So here, Patty's telling us like the struggle and the suffering that comes from being in a different country, right? And not only is she separated from her children are separated from each other, right? So she's got 2 young children here and 2 older children there. Where again, if we think about this issue of language, if we take language away from children, right, then not only are we disconnecting them from their parents, but also from their siblings, right, from their same level relationships, because we're assuming that their lives are solely rooted here, but they're not. For Patty, Dan's needs were not as pressing as the needs of her two older children, whom she had left in Mexico at the ages of 3 and 5 and hasn't seen in over a decade. Her participation in transnational parenting caused Patty great distress. Dan and Tanya have her as long as possible, but her other children only have her on the phone. Thinking about her children in Mexico and worrying about them was the only way she could mother them from afar, and in some ways assuage her guilt for getting pregnant with both Dan and Tanya and subsequently leaving them for so long. Yo y mi esposo habíamos planeado que 2 años. Le digo, ¿cómo en qué tiempo hacemos la casa? Dice, si tú llegas y trabajas y yo trabajo, en 2 años ya hicimos la casa. Y yo estuve de acuerdo. Dije, sí. Y sí, llegamos a los 3 meses, empecé a trabajar y él casi luego empezó a trabajar. Y sí, empezamos a trabajar, él empezó a construir, él estuvo construyendo. Al año yo salgo embarazada, o antes del año salgo embarazada de Dan. Patty had never intended to be apart from her older children indefinitely. The original plan was to come to the United States, work for 2 years, just long enough to buy land and build a house, and then go back. Her separation from her children was meant to be temporary, but then she got pregnant. Later, Patty goes on to reveal that she ends up having to stay home for a long period of time. And during that time where she's staying home, she gets pregnant again, right? So she becomes pregnant a second time. And we could look at this as an isolated incident, right? As an individual fault. Why would this woman get pregnant, right? If she knows that she's got this plan. But we have to, again, look at all of these other factors and social issues that are at play, right? She's an undocumented woman. She's afraid of going to the doctors, of getting medical care, which means that she doesn't have access to birth control. And she also doesn't have access to family planning, right? So in many ways, these women are never really allowed to make these decisions for themselves, right? There are these larger systemic machines and operations that are making these decisions for them. And then once they become mothers, they're never allowed to be solely mothers, right? Because so she's being a mother, but she also has to be a breadwinner and she has to bring in income so that they can return to their home. They're constantly bombarded with labels and expectations. And these are the struggles that, are compounded every single time these women had to encounter school agents, right? So we see mothers showing up to school and we expect them to just be here and totally focused and alert on this one child that they're here to discuss. But there's all this other stuff happening in the background, right? And so it's not that they're distracted because they don't want to be present, right? They're distracted because they're not allowed to be present, right? Because the conditions in their lives are so overwhelming and so complex. Whew, okay, fast breathing, but it's not all bad. Don't want to give that impression. Because the mothers, for the most part, also saw motherhood as purpose, right? It was something that gave them a sense of direction and also buoyancy. The issues and tensions that the mothers encounter were never readily volunteered, right? I had to create specific interview sets to be able to get this information out of the women. And it was also after many months of having established and developed a relationship with them as well, right? And paying attention, like, oh, this was a hint that was dropped. One of the most fascinating stories featured in the book, which is Anna's story, she revealed to me because I asked her, how did she accidentally learn how to text, right? That felt like such a superfluous question. But I also think that when talking to me, these women were also dropping hints in some ways so that they could be asked, so that they could feel like they had permission to talk about the really hard and heavy parts of motherhood. In most cases, the strife was alluded to, but never centered. It's possible that the mothers did not readily volunteer information about the burdens they bear, because for them, motherhood is not a duty, it's a blessing. While previous research on motherhood as a blessing exists, most of the literature related to mothering children with disabilities focuses on the struggle rather than the nuances, and often without recognition of how external factors, especially related to school, shape the maternal experience. For the women in this book, mother was in many cases their most valued title. Nonetheless, the mothers recognized that their relationships with their children were multifaceted, filled not only with mutual respect and admiration, but also with tensions, power struggles, and countless sacrifices. So they weren't unrealistic about their experiences as mothers, but there was this centering of, I'm so lucky to be a mother. I'm so grateful to be a mother. You know, this is why I'm alive kind of a thing, which really allowed them, I believe, to continue, right? To put one foot in front of the other. That was the thing, that was the driving force, even in the face of struggle. And so the third part of the book really focuses on moving forward, on how do we make space for mothers that isn't just in this one book, right? That isn't just these 10 mothers or these 3 focal mothers. How do we really make systemic change? And I close the book by sharing about the last time that I saw the mothers together, and by talking about how powerful that moment was for me, in hopes that we could get to a place in society where we can understand that storytelling is power, that storytelling is information, that storytelling is data, that storytelling is relational, and it's how we come together. And it's how we make space for different ways of being, right? Because right now there are certain ways of being that are really privileged within schools, and it's not necessarily reflected in all of the families that we serve. And so I just want to read this last bit, and then I'm done with Read Aloud. Okay, so this is very anticlimactic when I can't find my section. Okay. The first time I saw the mothers together was also the last time. Throughout my years working with descriptive inquiry, I had seen all of the ways in which shared storytelling turned individual strangers into a community. Sometimes the connections made during those recollections would develop into lifelong friendships, and sometimes they would fizzle out after a week. Still, regardless of the longevity of the resulting relationship, there was always something so powerful about that day. The day when the stories were told, the day when you learned to take up space and to give up space, the day you shared a part of yourself without context, without addendums, and connected with a room full of strangers around stories about entry or play. I wanted this for Patty, Maria, and Anna. I, like others, have known the loneliness of suffering and silence and the immense comfort of a supportive ear. In listening to their stories, I saw myself, my mother, my aunts, my former students' mothers. I understood both the specificity of their experience and the universality of their feelings. I also understood that while we would remain connected, the level of intimacy that had developed over months of conversation was not sustainable. Eventually, I had to write about what had been shared in order to report on the study's outcomes, but more importantly, as a way to honor the lives and stories that had been shared with me. I was also on the verge of becoming a mother for the second time. Ultimately, the relationship we had developed would change. I want to make it clear that I do not have any delusions of grandeur, nor believe that merely talking to me changed these women's lives. However, I do know that the power of storytelling, of friendship, of community, and participating in this study did offer that. Still, I knew that the most significant thing that I could give them was a moment to feel what I felt during my summers in Vermont, a moment to feel a part of a community. And with that in mind, the four of us gathered on a Sunday afternoon in my home to share a recollection and a meal. We all prepared stories to share around one prompt. Think back to a time when you felt connected to your child's learning and schooling experience, yet were also unclear as to how to support them. This can be a moment in which you ultimately felt successful, ineffective, frustrated, confused, or overwhelmed. Surprisingly to me, and I really mean this surprisingly because researchers think that they've thought and anticipated all of the outcomes. I had not anticipated this outcome at all. Surprisingly to me, none of the mothers really spoke to this question. Instead, they reflected on the things that get in the way of their support of their children's academic careers. They talked not only about language, but also about their own education levels. But the longest and strongest topic from the recollections that day tied together the suffering and stress that these mothers were enduring. Once again, a room of women who had never met before took the anonymity of sorts as an opportunity for release. Patty talked about Carlos Santos' drug abuse, Maria expounded on her husband's alcoholism, and Ana recounted her husband's affair. As each woman talked, the others nodded, not just in support, but also in agreement. They had been there. They knew this pain. After they were all done sharing, they began to talk openly about the similarities of their experiences. Maria revealed that her husband had also had an online affair. So had Patty's. Ana and Maria talked about how frustrated they felt by their Spanish monolingualism. Patty shared how frustrating it was to have access to classes, but lack availability. But they also talked about how much they loved their children, how much joy they found in motherhood, even if it was all-consuming and exhausting. They went on like this for 3 hours. That afternoon, we gathered for nearly 5 hours while sharing a meal. We shared our testimonios. We laughed. We cried. We came together and found comfort in each other. We recounted the moments that try to break us, and in doing so, showed our whole selves, if only for one day. Thank you. That's my spiel. Ba-dum-ba. And then I have this.
Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. How do you change this? Oh, Kimia, do you want to share your question out loud?
My question was, how do we change the labels placed among these mothers? So when you first began reading, you talked about how people called them different things. I forgot so far at the beginning, but just negative labels because they don't speak English. So how do we change those labels? Because I find myself correcting people often and reminding them that although they don't speak English, it doesn't mean that they don't know. It's just that they don't speak English.
Yeah, I think part of it is just having those conversations, right? And kind of changing the culture, but also changing the ways in which parents can be present in our school communities, right? Because it's really easy to think that a parent has nothing if they can't offer something in the only medium you've made available. So I think if finding other ways to give parents opportunity to be present and engaged and to really foreground their funds of knowledge, right, is really important. Because I think what ends up happening when we talk about parents, and particularly when we talk about mothers, we think about and I've done this myself, right? I'm not in any way. And I also recognize, and I talk about this in the book, that we've asked schools to take on a lot, right? And in asking schools to take on so much, we've made it impossible for them to take on things that they should, right? Like offering parents workshops around how to do the homework, like being able to have those conversations. But it's because we've put so much on schools, right? Including the mental and physical health of students, right? And while some places have been able to do that successfully, we have to recognize that a lot of places have also not, right? They've struggled because we've been asking schools to do more, but at the same time, we've been giving schools less money with which to do this, right? So I think part of it is just having conversations around that and recognizing that we can't make space for families if we're not making space for them as they are, right? Rather than just focusing on what do we need parents to do and how do we get them to do it, right? Which I think is a lot of conversations that happen at schools. Thank you. If there are no more questions, I can go home. Just kidding. Eva, do you have a question? Eva?
Hello. I'm glad that we had the opportunity to hear about your work. Actually, I just wanted to mention that as a mother of English learners, in environments that were primarily monolingual, monocultural, a parent that, like you, I am, or used to be at that time, a faculty member in an institution of higher education, trying to advocate for my own children, I felt very lonely in that process. And I cannot tell, but I can imagine how lonely this process of supporting children academically could have been for some of the mothers that you work with. Mm-hmm. Not to say to advocate for them. There were times when the dismissal of whatever I could contribute was so powerful that I felt like I really should not, I should just stay home and not get engaged. But, it's all I'm saying is that, like you mentioned, we really have to start looking at that relational component of teacher and parents. Like you say, not from what we expect it to be, but for what it is, and trying to give the space. And I think the pandemic has actually opened a lot of opportunities for us to think beyond that physical space, to open opportunities to build on those teacher and parents, mothers relationships. The truth is that without the parents, in many of our homes, education will not have been able to take place at all during the last year and a half. So, I think I support your point that we need to start really, even if it gets uncomfortable, we really have to step out of our boxes to reach out to families, because in the long run, it's not only good for each children or their families, but it's also for the community, and it's also good for society, as we keep working on it.
And for the fields of education, right? If we truly want more teachers of diverse backgrounds, of diverse capacities to enter the field of education, then we have to make these students feel good about school, right? We have to make these families feel good about school, because I can tell you very clearly and transparently, I am in this profession because I love school, and because school for me was a really affirming place in ways that other parts of society, right, were not. And I think that that's true for a lot of neurodiverse kids, and it could be true for so many more neurodiverse and also just linguistically diverse kids, right? And if more kids feel good about school, then more kids are going to want to replicate that, right? And they're going to want to be teachers. We keep talking about the shortage in bilingual education and bilingual special education from a position of, financial issues, of educational backgrounds. But we also need to be thinking about, how is it that these kids are feeling about school, right? How is it that these families are feeling about school from the very beginning? That leads you to be at this place where you want to be a teacher, right? I've had so many teacher candidates, right? Applications that I've reviewed, that it's like, I wanted to be a teacher since I was a little girl, right? And that can feel really foreign to someone who did not feel that way as a child, right? And so I think part of what we need to be looking at in terms of teacher shortages, right, is not just what we're doing to get teachers through certification programs, but what we're doing at the very beginning of that pipeline, because the beginning of that pipeline is our classrooms, right?
Mhm.
So thank you for sharing, Eva.
Sure, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions about the process or about any of this? Oh, I see one in the chat.
Donna says you touched upon the first language being a hindrance to special education. Did you come across times in your research when the parent could no longer communicate with their child?
Yes, so there's several instances. So Patty, for example, one of the tensions that came through in her work was that eventually her son Dan was placed in English only classrooms. And because she's mothering 4 kids, because she's also trying to work, right, to like save money to either bring her kids here or for her to return and build that house in Mexico, she doesn't have time, right, to go to adult ESL classes on Wednesday nights, right, from 6 to 9 p.m. She doesn't have childcare. If her husband has to work, then she's the one who has to stay home. So all of these avenues that were offered to her as a way to bridge it, right, actually put more burden on her rather than taking it away. And so by the time that they were part of this study, Patty was just talking about the constant fighting that was happening between her and her child and the ways in which he would use language to belittle her, right? So he would then say, I feel like I'm the smartest person in my family because I'm the only one who speaks English. So now, right, so like, what are we doing to these families when we're making these decisions that are pedagogically sound, right? But that really reflect the needs and interests of the school rather than the needs and interests of the child or the family. So thank you for that, Donna. Chris.
Yes, mine was more of a general comment. I think this is a very powerful example of like what you said, we can't make space for families if we can't take them as they are. I think you did that with your research methodologies and really looking for that narrative from the people that are affected by this. But there was just something that really struck with me because I work in an urban school where there's a lot of times I have a lot of bilingual students who are also labeled with certain learning disabilities. So where you said it's more importantly for them to be normal than connected to their community, I think that is really a huge thing that we need to look more at. And I was wondering if maybe you could maybe speak a little bit more to that, because I found that really powerful, especially in a lot of the work that I do.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so that's a line of kind of inquiry or thought that I've kind of been working on for a few years. And I have a piece called Bilingualism, Disability, and Normalcy, right? Something where I kind of trace the fact that in order to be normal, right, this idea of the bell curve is kind of introduced, but in order to be normal, you have to fall and split in the middle, right, of the majority. It's not actually a real majority numerically, it's a majority in terms of power, right, and positionality. So to be normal in the United States is to be a male, right, white male, middle class, heterosexual, heteronormative, right, and of average intelligence and all of these things. And so for anybody who strays away from that, right, it's going to be really hard for them to attain something that middle group can't, right? So what does that mean? So we've started, when we were advocating for bilingual education, right, we started to talk about it as a superpower, right? Like this amazing thing and this financial commodity. Well, if we think about language in terms of capitalist structures, right, then the people who we view as being the least productive, right, or the least contributing to this capitalist project, we're going to not want to give that power over to them, right? So if we're saying that it's important to be a bilingual person in order to be in the business world, if I don't believe that you're going to fit into the business world, then that's not a resource that I should expend on you. And we saw this first as happening to brown children, right? Brown and Black children who are immigrants, who they come to the US, they get put into ESL programs at the same time that white middle class students are taking over dual language immersion programs, right? Meant to maintain their linguistic development. But we also then see this happening for students with disabilities, right? Where if you are disabled, then our priority is to make sure that you get English, right? English is the focus because we as a school need to communicate with you. We need you to understand our rules, our behaviors, all of these things, right? So English becomes a tool for domination of the student, right? Rather than a way to really set them up for success, right? Because if we believed in them being set up for success, then we would know that for people with disabilities especially, right, community support is critical to their survival and to their independence into adulthood. So why would we then alienate them from their communities, alienate them from their families, right? So we're not thinking about this in the long term unless we're thinking about these people as insignificant, right? And so we think about these families as insignificant because the impact that it has on them is indifferent to us, right? And we think about these children as insignificant because the impact that it has on them is also insignificant to us, right? Because we care more about growth, right? Growth of test scores, growth of incomes, growth of GDP, right? Like all of these other things rather than communal and social growth. It's a very dismal answer. Great question though, but that's how I see it. Others may see it different. But I think it's also what's reflected in the policies, right? It's what we see. It's that, you know, violations to IDEA are taken much more seriously than violations to the Bilingual Education Act, right? Or to any other kind of, and it's because we don't see value in it for this population.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Iran would like to know, how long did it take you to establish this relationship with the mothers to make them feel comfortable enough to share such personal stories? Can you share about the work you did to be able to engage the mothers and strengthen your relationship as a researcher in that space?
Oh, thank you so much, Idan. It's a great question. I think the most honest answer is to say that a lot of capital was invested in me, a lot of social capital and a lot of, so I went to communities that I had a relationship with. So there was an organization known as Mixteca, which is in Greenwood Heights, which is adjacent to Sunset Park, and they provided a lot of services. So they let me set up a table at one of the Mexican consulate events, right? The fact that I was inside that space during such like a tense kind of political situation, right? Let people know that I was okay, I was safe, right? Similarly, I made contacts and relationships with places of worship. So many priests and deacons, they spoke on behalf of me, right? And they would introduce me to their communities and say, I really encourage you to talk to Maria. She's doing good work. You can trust her, you know, it's safe. In order to, I also was really aware of the symbolism of the relationships to the churches in the community. I had attended all, you know, the churches that were there. So for example, the interviews, I would primarily do them in a little classroom space that the church let me borrow, right? And I think it offered mothers a sense of safety. One, it was a separate space from their home, so they could really talk to me without worrying about their husbands or children kind of hearing, or their mother-in-laws. But also the church reminded them that I was safe, right? That I had been introduced to them in this space. So wherever I had met a mother, right? So like if I met you at Mixteca, I would meet with you at Mixteca for interviews. If I met you at the church, I would meet with you at the church. I also, because I had been a teacher in the community for such a long time, I had a lot of families that could vouch for me. You know, so it was long. I had been a member of this community for a very long time. This really, for me, was my life's work, right? Even when I didn't know it, which is why I think it's so interesting that we so often discourage scholars, especially scholars of color, from doing research in their communities, because we devalue the value, right? We devalue the importance of relationships, of people knowing you, of people knowing my mother, right? Of people knowing my sister. So I think that that was really, really critical. I did a study last summer around remote schooling and COVID-19. And this, these women were where I started, and they referred so many other women to me, right? Because they had seen that their participation in the process turned out the way that I had promised, right? I really protected them, I protected their identities, and I made sure that I was available to them when they needed me as well, not just when I needed them. So thank you, Ida. I think we're done. Can we all go home early now, Patty?
You can go home anytime you want to. You're the brains of this outfit here.
I just want to say thank you to Lori for being here, and Rebecca, and all of my students.
Nice to see shining faces, isn't it? Happy people.
It's so nice. Do any of my students have any questions around how the process from dissertation to book, or anything around that?
Take your opportunity. This may be on a test.
It won't. There's no test in my class.
Can you just
Maria, I
share?
did actually have that question though, because when you mentioned that, I was just like, wait, how do you do that? So yes, that's the question.
So one of the things for me is so there are very technical parts that I had to write for their dissertation for my committee that would have just been really boring for anybody else to read, right? So I took a lot of creative license when it came to things like presenting my methods, right? Or presenting what my recruitment or my participants were. I really tried to take the dissertation. I can send you a copy, Eden. Yeah, if you send me an email. The major shift was taking out all of the kind of technical things. I did very little around the mother chapters themselves, because I really, really made sure, even in my dissertation, that they were central. And that caused some tension with my committee, because a lot of our job is supposed to be around analysis. But that's why it was really important for me to make that argument as to why these women's voices had to be centered rather than mine, right? I was like, I'm in the tower, like I'm already inside, I'm at the table, right? Like, so my responsibility is to bring in these voices. So for the rest of it, it was just things like, how would I want to read this, right? I took note from fiction authors that I love, which are very few, right? But I also thought especially, and I thank them in the acknowledgements of my book, but I thought about the way Toni Morrison writes about women, right? And I thought about the way that Kate DiCamillo talks to an audience. I thought about the way that, oh my gosh, the last name, the author of The Arc of Justice, right? How he was able to really tell this nonfiction story in a way that felt like a Greek tragedy. So I knew that it existed. And so what I did was that I read books that I loved one more time, and I found ways to take my book and turn it into that, right? So like, how do I take this story that's here and tell it like a story, instead of just, these are the facts and these are the steps and these are the things that I did. Is that helpful? But I will say that it took me about 18 months to go from dissertation to book. And it was hard.
I'm surprised.
But fun. Yeah, I was really focused on trying to get tenure, so I wanted to make sure I had all my ducks in a row. But also I was really, really eager. I knew that books are not the thing actually that gains people tenure in the academy, but I knew that books were the way that I was going to get this into the hands of teachers, into the hands of policymakers, And I knew that this was the just thing to do for these women, because this was not a risk-free endeavor for them, right? There were lots of women who had signed up, and when I would call to do the screening, their husbands would answer and be like, what's this about? And thought I had to do with immigration and would hang up the phone, right? So there were real, threats involved and real risk involved in participating in a study of this nature, in a really unsteady time, right? Trump had just taken office. By the spring when I was doing all of these meetings. Oh, and it's important to mention Sunset Park was also going through a lot of raids in the springtime. So this was a tense and scary time. So for me, it was just, I needed to honor that risk. I needed to make sure that these stories were put into action. And I will share, and then I think maybe we can close, that one of the things that I also wanted to make sure was that this book was accessible to the women who were part of this study. And so I've paid with my own money to have the book translated to Spanish, to be able to share it with them, because it was important for them to see themselves the way that I saw them and the way that so many new readers are going to start seeing them. So, thank you.
Maria, thank you so much. And not only just for tonight, but thank you for the book. Thank you for the research, and thank you for the work. It's a really, really important lesson for the world right now. And I hope it goes far and wide.
Thank you. Share with your friends.